And then, another voice. Not the boy's, but one because of him. A new prophet, one who would prepare the way for a fire Elijah himself would never see descend. The courtroom hadn't just debated a child's fate. They debated Elijah's legacy. The boy he raised would echo in the lives of those Elijah would never meet. And the cost? His silence. No one would ever believe him. He would never speak of what he saw, not to kings, not to other prophets. The boy's purpose wasn't for fame. It was for timing. And time, Elijah now understood, had secrets it only whispered through pain. As he watched the scroll burn from the edges inward, Elijah turned to the altar. The flame was almost gone. But one final shape formed above it, a crown of thorns. Elijah didn't understand. Not then. But he knew one thing with cruel certainty: the boy's survival had shifted everything. And the future would demand more blood than he could imagine. The spirits returned, not many, just 3. They circled the flame in silence, each carrying a jar. One poured oil. One poured tears. One poured blood. Then they vanished. The flame rose once more. And with it, Elijah was thrown back into his body, drenched in sweat, weeping silently beneath the stars. His hands clutched the rooftop tiles as though they were the only things keeping him tethered to earth. The boy slept below, peaceful. But Elijah knew peace had been purchased with a secret. A secret he would never tell. A truth too heavy to pass down. In the morning, the widow asked why his eyes were swollen. He said it was the wind. She asked why he wouldn't eat. He said he was full. But inside, Elijah carried the weight of knowing he had saved more than a life. He had preserved a sound, a cry destined to tear open the heavens one day. And now, every decision he made, every word he spoke, would echo in the shadow of that cry. He was no longer just a prophet. He was a guardian of a timeline. And timelines do not forgive careless hands. The boy began to change, though subtly. He sat longer in silence. He stared at fires like they were speaking to him. He asked no questions, yet his presence unsettled even the most devout elders. There was an energy in him, unformed, electric. Elijah watched from afar, afraid to get too close. Not because he feared the boy, but because he feared what he would say if the child ever asked, "Why did you bring me back?" Because Elijah didn't know if he could answer honestly. Because your voice wasn't done. That truth burned too brightly to hold. In the years that followed, Elijah left Zarephath. He returned to a land still aching from drought. He called down fire. He silenced false prophets. He outran chariots. But the vision never left him. On quiet nights, he still heard the courtroom. He still saw the scroll. And he still wondered if saving the boy had cursed or blessed the future. But he would never regret it. Because in every whisper of wind, in every cry of justice, he heard the echo of a child once dead, now destined to prepare the way for something greater than even Elijah himself. And in this, Elijah found peace, not the kind that rests, but the kind that walks forward. A peace that carries weight. A peace that whispers, "You were part of something vast." He would never be the same. He would never speak of what he saw. But he would watch. And he would wait. Because someday, somewhere, another voice would rise in a wilderness. And when it did, it would carry the thunder of that courtroom, the light of that flame, and the memory of a prophet who once stretched himself over a child, and saw eternity blink. The child lived. But Elijah did not return the same man. From the moment he descended those stairs, carrying the breath-restored boy in his arms, something inside him remained suspended. As if a part of him never left that courtroom. His hands moved through life, but his soul walked in silence. The widow sang psalms louder than ever. The neighbors told stories of the holy man who defeated death. But Elijah heard none of it. He began sleeping on rooftops, closer to the wind. Not for clarity, but distance. He no longer trusted the comfort of walls. The boy's eyes had changed. No longer wide with innocence, they carried a quiet awareness that pierced deeper than questions. He rarely spoke, yet listened to everything, as though the earth itself whispered answers to him that others couldn't hear. He would sit beside Elijah and just breathe, matching the prophet's rhythm like a shadow echoing its master. Sometimes, Elijah would glance down and wonder, is he watching me, or waiting for me? But the child only blinked, slow and still, as though time no longer touched him the same. Weeks passed like dust blown across an unused road. Elijah moved through the motions of survival. Chopping wood, gathering water, muttering half-prayers to a God who had recently shown him too much. There was no clear instruction. No divine word. Just the weight of what he had seen, stitched into the back of his thoughts. Some nights he woke gasping, not because of visions, but because his body could no longer forget the sensation of laying over a dead child and touching something eternal. It wasn't trauma. It was transformation. But it felt like mourning something he never named. When the child laughed again, it was a sound too sharp. It cut the air. Elijah nearly dropped the clay pot he was holding. The boy had tripped over a rock and giggled, dust in his teeth, eyes squinting into the sun. The widow rushed out with motherly joy, kissing his cheeks, praising God. But Elijah stepped backward. That sound, so alive, felt foreign. He wasn't afraid of the boy. He was afraid of what joy reminded him of, that he had interfered with something sacred. And now, everything ordinary bore the scent of divine disruption. The widow didn't ask why Elijah grew quieter. She had lost him once to hunger, and once to her son's death. She wasn't about to lose him to questions. But she watched him, always watched. Especially on nights when he climbed the stairs and didn't come down. Especially when he returned from prayer with a tremor in his shoulders, like someone who had survived a vision he hadn't asked for. Once, she tried to thank him again. He stopped her with a look so hollow she forgot the words. Gratitude was a wound now. Kindness only made it bleed. Elijah sat beneath the fig tree behind the house, rubbing his thumb across the grain of his staff, waiting. For what, he didn't know. Instructions? Peace? Forgiveness? Perhaps just the courage to forget. But forgetting was not part of the bargain. He had touched destiny. He had wrestled with divine outcomes. And now, every second of his life was a ripple from that moment. The boy ran past him, chasing birds with a woven toy. Elijah didn't smile. He just closed his eyes and whispered into the wind. What did I save? But the wind didn't answer. He began noticing changes in the air. Strange weather. Shifts in the way animals moved. Clouds that formed too quickly and vanished without rain. Signs. But signs of what? The courtroom vision still haunted him, the cracked altar, the flaming scroll, the spirits bearing oil, tears, and blood. He remembered the crown of thorns above the altar. It returned in his dreams like a ghost, glowing and weeping, floating above rivers stained red. He wanted to pray, but feared the voice that might respond. What if God did not answer in words, but in silence heavy enough to crush? The child, though alive, never asked about his collapse. Never mentioned visions or voices. But he had become different. He knew things no one taught him. He asked no questions, but built altars of stone for no reason. He lined them up with the stars. He sat for hours staring at fire as though it had a mouth. The villagers called it wisdom. The widow called it favor. But Elijah called it consequence. This was the cost of resurrection, to live with mystery embedded in your breath, and to have no one explain it to you, not even the one who saved you. Then came the storm. Not a spiritual one, though those never stopped, but a real one. Violent, black, and thundering. Rain had not touched Zarephath in months, yet now it pounded the earth like judgment. Lightning split a tree near the widow's home. The boy stood beneath the downpour, eyes closed, arms open, as though welcoming it. Elijah pulled him inside by the wrist. For the first time, their eyes locked without innocence. Something passed between them. Not fear. Not rebellion. But memory. He remembers, Elijah thought. But the boy said nothing. Only dried off and went to bed. That night Elijah broke. He returned to the upper room, the place where death had once exhaled and life had inhaled again. He collapsed onto the same bed, chest heaving, whispering, "Why did you let me see it?" The silence that followed was more brutal than rejection. It was agreement. God would not explain himself. Elijah had been chosen not to understand, but to carry. He wept, not out of sorrow, but because he finally knew the vision wasn't for him. It was for the voice he had returned to the world. And prophets do not always get to hear the echoes they preserve. He left before sunrise. No farewells. No explanations. Just a note scratched into the table, "The child is yours." But his voice is not. The widow read it and wept. The boy watched from the doorway, unmoved. As Elijah disappeared beyond the hill, something flickered in the boy's expression, understanding maybe. Or grief. Or the quiet settling of a purpose that no child should carry. He turned back inside. He would not see Elijah again. But Elijah would never stop seeing him. In every cry for justice. In every silence before a storm. In every echo that sounded too familiar. Elijah wandered from Zarephath into the wilderness, alone again, but not empty. He now walked as one haunted by glory. He knew things he couldn't say. He had touched the timeline and walked back with a scar no eye could see. The world called him a prophet. The heavens knew better. He was a hinge. A doorway. A soul who once stopped death not by command, but by surrender. And the boy he saved? He was no longer a child. He was a flame in waiting. And someday, he would light a path Elijah could not walk. People would one day write songs about Elijah. About fire from heaven and rain from dry skies. About altars consumed and idols crushed. But no one would sing about the boy. No one would know his name. Yet every note would still echo because of him. Because Elijah wept on a rooftop for a life that didn't seem to matter. But mattered more than even angels could say. And that's the cruel miracle of legacy. It often survives through those who never asked for it. In voices that never know the price paid to keep them breathing. Elijah did not regret it. Even when the visions returned. Even when the silence grew colder. Even when he walked alone for days without a whisper from heaven. He had once touched a soul that was meant to burn bright. And now, his role was to disappear slowly, like the wick that lit the flame. He would never again speak the boy's name. But he would carry it. In every prayer, every warning, every sleepless night. Because he now understood, some prophets don't shape the future by what they say, but by what they save. The years passed in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't fall, but coils. The boy grew in body, but his presence never lost its stillness. He worked in the widow's field with strong hands and quiet obedience, yet something burned in him that no labor could exhaust. He did not chase pleasure. He did not chase praise. He chased something deeper, something no one else could see. The villagers called him strange. The priests called him blessed. The children avoided his eyes. He never explained. He simply lived. And in his breath, a seed stirred, waiting for the season to ignite. The widow watched her son become a man with wonder and unease. He obeyed, but never begged. He served, but never flattered. His prayers were short, spoken at dawn into the wind, as though reporting to someone older than God. He once stood in the rain for hours, unmoving, lips parted like he was tasting something only the Spirit could offer. When she asked him what he saw, he said nothing. He just smiled. But it was not a boy's smile. It was the smile of someone who had been given back, someone who knew the cost of breath. His name faded from memory, even in the town that raised him. He became the widow's son, then simply the quiet one. He took no wife. He built no home. Instead, he wandered into the hills beyond Zarephath, returning only with wild herbs, strange stories, and a fire in his eyes that never dimmed. The priest grew nervous. He did not mock them, yet his presence made their rituals feel rehearsed. One whispered, "He sees us." Another muttered, "He waits for something." But none could name what that something was. Not even the widow. Only Elijah would have known. In the hidden places of the land, rumors began to form. A young man with eyes like cracked skies. A voice that made animals still. A stare that unraveled lies. He healed no one. He preached no sermons. He simply was. And yet, wherever he walked, the ground felt older. As though prophecy remembered him. He carved symbols into trees, sang psalms backward in the dark, and fasted beneath eclipsed moons. Those who mocked him found their mouths dry for days. Those who followed him heard nothing, but couldn't forget him. He was not trying to be a prophet. He was becoming one. Years after Elijah vanished from Zarephath, word came, fire had fallen on Mount Carmel. Prophets of Baal lay charred in the valley. The skies had opened after years of drought. The people had cried, "The Lord is God!" The widow wept with joy. But her son simply stared into the distance and said, "It has begun." No one asked him what it was. But he began walking the edges of villages after that, just watching. Listening. Preparing. Because the sound that once echoed in the courtroom of spirits had begun to ripple through time. And he, the echo, was awakening. Elijah's name grew into thunder. But the boy, now a man, remained a shadow behind that thunder. He built no altar. Called down no flame. Yet when he stood near fire, it rose higher. When he spoke to sheep, they followed him. The villagers stopped questioning him and began fearing him. But their fear had no malice. It was the fear you feel before a lightning strike, the recognition of power still sheathed. The widow aged quietly. And as her son carried her water each morning, she wondered if she had birthed a child, or been entrusted with something far older. He took to the wilderness. Not in retreat, but in obedience. Something had begun to pull him from the fabric of towns and markets and familiar paths. He lived off honey and roots. He slept on stones. He began wrapping himself in rough camel hair, not for fashion, but for memory. He was preparing, though he never said for what. Sometimes he stood at rivers for hours, hands outstretched, whispering words only the wind could repeat. Once, a storm gathered above him and broke only when he dropped to his knees. He didn't move, even as rain soaked him through. He began speaking, but only in fragments. He would leave phrases carved into bark. "Prepare the way. The axe is laid to the root. One comes after me." The elders dismissed him. But the children began dreaming of rivers. The sick began walking to the edges of town, murmuring his name. The widows left him baskets of bread. And the prophets grew quiet. For though he had no title, no scrolls, and no lineage to boast of, he carried a gravity that turned doubt to dust. And behind his eyes was something ancient. Something Elijah once wept over alone. In the wilderness, he found his rhythm. Fast. Speak. Disappear. Repeat. He baptized no one yet, but he washed his hands daily in the Jordan like a rehearsal. He watched the sky for signs. He listened to thunder for patterns. He traced the moon's shadows on the ground, looking for symbols Elijah once glimpsed in heaven's court. And though the people did not understand him, they followed him. Not because he promised healing, but because he promised fire. Not a fire to destroy, but a fire to burn away the things pretending to be light. He never spoke of Elijah. Never uttered the prophet's name. But once, during a fast, he built a small altar of stones in the wilderness and whispered, "I remember." Then he scattered the stones and walked away. The wind carried his words, but only the river listened. He had been saved for this. He had been restored, not just to live, but to become a flame-bearer. Not the torch itself, but the spark. The one who cries before the silence breaks. The one who prepares a path that only another's feet will walk. The one who makes room for fire,